This idea of NoFap, which is, I believe, and you clearly know much more about this than I do, Dr. K, but I believe that the term is, it's proposing a solution to the pornography challenge that some people have, where you completely abstain from watching pornography and or masturbating at all. Rena, if I recall, and I don't want to mischaracterize your opinion here, but I think when we spoke the first time on the podcast, you made the case that masturbation does have positive impacts. So what is your view on this idea of NoFap?
Yeah, so I think the movement, so the idea of retaining from or abstaining from masturbation or watching pornography is a very individual one, and it may have benefits for some people in terms of because if they're using these things in a negative way, abstaining from them may allow them to have more control over other portions of their life. But a lot of people will misinform people and say, oh, you're going to have a higher testosterone, you're going to have all these physiologic changes, which have not been borne out in the literature. There's like a very small study looking at men who abstained from ejaculation for 21 days that saw a very small, minute increase in testosterone. It was like 10 guys. So it's not generalizable. It's never been repeated. And testosterone varies as it is quite significantly over days and throughout the day and, one day to the next. So ultimately, there's no evidence to support the fact that abstaining from anything like masturbation is actually going to have a benefit. More likely than not, either you're going to have a nocturnal emission or your body's going to absorb that semen. So it doesn't really change what's going on physiologically.
Is there an impact on fertility if I masturbate or don't masturbate?
Yes. So fertility, we do see that if you abstain for about 5 days, up to 5 days, you're going to see some improvement in the semen volume potentially, and also some characteristics of the sperm. But above and beyond that, you start seeing DNA damage. And so that can actually be negative if you abstain for too long.
So the sperm are effectively dying in the
Well, you're
scrotum.
seeing like mutation, so they're not as effective. They're not going to die necessarily, but they're not going to create a healthy, fetus or embryo.
Dr. K, NoFap?
That's fascinating. I didn't know that. So really interesting. So a couple of things to understand. So there are a lot of traditions that abstain from sexual activity. I think we don't study those traditions very well, and I think the key thing to understand, I personally think that celibacy and abstinence from sexual activity can be incredibly powerful. And so I think part of what we have to remember, right? So if we don't have any evidence for something, why do so many people believe it? So some of it is there's a lot of bad information out there, but what happens on the NoFap community is that people are having some experiences and they're saying, this kind of thing changed my life. And there's so many layers to that. So the first is that I think NoFap is kind of a way to wrestle with any kind of behavioral control. So if we look at people who are addicted to pornography, we talk about all of these negative impacts of this cycle of, I don't have anything to do anything today, so I'm going to jerk off, and then I have no meaning, no purpose, no dopamine. So I'm just stuck in this cycle. So they want to break the cycle and they just pick one thing. And I think just challenging yourself from a self-control perspective, I completely agree with what Malik says. There may not be a physiological thing going on here, but just challenging yourself and saying, hey, this one thing messes up my relationships, messes up my dopamine, messes up my purpose and my motivation. I'm going to take control of this and it'll change my life. So I think if you look at it from an isolated stance of masturbation, it may not have much of an effect. We'll talk about the exception to that rule in a second in the spiritual traditions. But I think that a lot of people are just using it as a vehicle to come to terms with something challenging in their life. And they're making a commitment, right? I'm going to do this thing. And the benefit comes from that, maybe not any physiological thing. All the stuff about testosterone and stuff, completely agree. I don't think that there's a clear thing there. But if you look at some of the meditative traditions, one of the really common things, and this is really fascinating because this is true of meditative or religious traditions all over the world. So you'll see celibacy is a part of some of the Abrahamic religions. It's part of some of the karmic religions from the East. So human beings at some point figured out that abstaining from sexual activity can have different kinds of impacts in the organism. So a couple of things that it does is it reduces our thoughts of lust if we do it the right way. And we'll get to a couple of specific examples of what the NoFap community doesn't understand. So when I deprive myself of a particular thing, I sometimes reduce that behavioral reinforcement. So if I look at someone who's addicted to alcohol, when they stop drinking alcohol at the very beginning, their desire will increase. But then 10 years later, they don't even think about it. So if you are someone who is thinking about sex constantly and you stop engaging in sexual perceptions, so remember, the thoughts in our brain come from what we perceive. This is why advertising is a thing, because an advertiser knows if I can show you this thing, you will think about it. Now, if I'm fapping and watching pornography, I'm getting this perceptual input, which is then creating thoughts in my head. Now I'm thinking about this stuff instead of thinking about something else. So there's that layer of thing too. When I cut something off from my perception, when I break up with someone, why do I block them? Because if I watch their social media, if I get text from them, that's going to enter my perception and control my thoughts. So they can also use it as a benefit of like thought control if I stop looking at this stuff. This has also been hijacked by, generally speaking, patriarchal structures for like, there's a particular religious sect of Hinduism where the priests are like, I'm never going to see a woman. Like no women are allowed in the house if I'm going to come visit your house, right? So this gets turned into some weird things. But so NoFap gives us an opportunity for self-control. It gives us a chance to reduce our sensory input, which reduces our thoughts. And then there's also these meditative traditions which say that, achieving esoteric spiritual experiences, which is a lot of what the NoFap community like talks about, like they become slightly different human beings. Celibacy is a part of that. Now, the key thing about the meditative traditions is that they're not taking advice from randos on the internet. So I'll give you all just one really simple example. When you do esoteric meditations, spirituality, celibacy kind of stuff, it's usually accompanied in the Hindu tradition or Buddhist tradition with certain yogic postures. And one example of this is something called Siddhasana. Siddhasana is a depth's pose. And literally what you do is in this pose, you place the heel of your right foot usually up against your perineum. So you put pressure on the area between your anus and your scrotum if you're a man. It's a slightly different location if you're a woman. And then what that actually does from anatomy, I'm sure you know this better than I, correct me if I'm wrong, is that, we know that the blood supply to the scrotum passes through that, right? It's on the underside. It's like in that pelvic floor region. So one of the really interesting things that I remember learning from a yogi who was a medical doctor is that when we compress blood flow through the testes, like if you have gently compressed blood flow that increases over time, you're going to get less blood flow to the testes. You may get some kind of reduction in testosterone production and semen production or whatever. So there may be some physiological things that people do when they're normally like try to be celibate that allow it to be healthy in a good way. So I think kind of the key takeaway, don't disagree with anything that Dr. Malik said. I think you've got to remember that NoFap is not a surefire solution to fix all your problems. And at the same time, some people have positive experiences. Also, Dr. Malik has been emphasizing this point of it's not the same for everybody. And we know that there are a couple of things working with this community quite a bit. There are a couple of things that happen about self-control, challenging yourself, setting a goal, creating purpose in your life, changing what your sensory inputs are. So you're not thirsty all day long and thinking about being horny and all this kind of stuff. Like sometimes you got to kind of cut it out of your life. And so it's almost like this cold turkey kind of approach, which can sometimes work for nicotine, can sometimes work for things like sex. But I think like your mileage may vary, and we don't really know exactly what's going on.
Yeah, I think I'll add, I think the problem I have with it to some degree is when people are white knuckling it, right? They're getting peer pressured into it. Like, you got to stop, right? And so then they're really trying hard not to ejaculate. And so they're tensing up their pelvic floor muscles. They're developing problems because they're tensing up their pelvic floors. They're developing dysfunctions. They're getting pain with ejaculation. They're getting pain with erections, or they get so much shame when they have a nocturnal emission, for example.
A nocturnal emission is a nighttime ejaculation.
Exactly. So they're getting so shamed by the community because they've failed, which is completely out of their physiologic control. Like, you're going to have a nocturnal emission if your body wants to have one. There's nothing you can do about it. So, I think ultimately there is a lot of shame and peer pressure that can sometimes create harm in these situations. Now, if you're using it in the way Dr. K described, like, that's fine. If you're deriving benefit from it, I have no problem. But I do take issue with the people who are harming themselves because they're getting a lot of pressure from the group.
If I can jump in for a second. So I want to emphasize this point too. So this is really weird, but people are white knuckling it. They may be making their addiction actually worse. So there's a really interesting principle in addiction where if I'm white knuckling something, let's use the example of like opioid addiction, right? So when I'm working with an opioid addict, at the very beginning, what they have is like a psychological craving. Like I want to have an opiate so that I feel better. I feel better. I feel euphoria. And then if I white knuckle it, what happens is things start to get worse. Then I start to go into withdrawal. And then my body is like, now I'm going into opioid withdrawal. So instead of euphoria, now I start to feel pain all over my body. And as I feel pain all over my body, then finally what happens is I crack. And then I use opioids. And then something really interesting happens. The body learns what it has to do to you to make you use opioids again. So when you white knuckle and actually crack at the end, what we find is that the body jumps straight to level 10, right? So it's kind of like, we see this also with like kids and devices. Mommy, daddy, can I have an iPad? No. And then they're like, mommy, daddy, please, no. And then they start crying, then they start throwing a temper tantrum. If you give them the iPad when they throw a temper tantrum, that encourages them to throw a temper tantrum. And we see that internally, biologically, physiologically, where if you resist an addiction and then you cave at the end, the body is like, hey, there's no point messing around with the early stages. Let's just go to hard withdrawal way faster. So I think it can be so harmful when people are white knuckling it. They don't realize that every time they fail, sometimes what they're actually doing is training their brain to punish them way harder so their brain can get the dopamine that it wants.
If you love the Diary of a CEO brand and you watch this channel, please do me a huge favor. Become part of the 15% of the viewers on this channel that have hit the subscribe button. It helps us tremendously, and the bigger the channel gets, the bigger the guests.